Hey everyone, welcome to our last week of KNR 440 and your last lecture. I know you're very excited to hear that. And it's our last one, so I'm going to keep it brief. I just have 12 slides here, including the intro slide and the exit slide. So I am going to keep it brief and just go over some key concepts related to Salesforce management. Now, the bulk of the semester, we've focused on kind of what it takes to be a successful ticket seller and what that process looks like from the individual ticket seller's perspective. But I do think it's important that we talk a little bit about the concept of management of sales forces within the sport industry. Successful sales managers are definitely critical for sport organizations. As we know, there's a lot of turnover in ticket sales for sport organizations. These sales departments often employ the largest subset of employees within a sport organization. So, given those two pieces of information, it's really crucial that teams hire and retain really talented and high quality managers. So, we're going to talk a little bit today about kind of what the process of managing ticket sellers looks like. Maybe discuss a little bit about that process as well as kind of some of the differences between maybe what it takes to be a good ticket seller versus what it takes to be a good ticket manager. A question that I always like to ask at the beginning of this unit is, do successful sales reps make good sales managers? I think intuitively a lot of people just assume that, yeah, if you're successful at generating revenue for a sport organization, then you're probably going to be successful managing individuals. And the truth is that's not always the case. If you think about it like this, good sales reps are often individual thinkers, right? They're focused on individual success and accomplishment, which is not surprising given kind of the high stakes competitive environment that we've created within sport organizations. And this might make them really successful at selling tickets, but it doesn't always translate well to management, right? Think about managers as more of a coach, right? A coach is more focused on group performance or team performance and less about individual performance. So, the skill sets aren't always similar or don't always cross over. So it's important to realize that just because someone might generate a lot of revenue in terms of being a seller, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good manager. And there are certainly some key traits that you'd want to identify that would make someone a good manager. And that's not always going to be, that they can actually sell tickets. I can tell you from my experience working with the Blues, the two or three ticket sales managers that I saw there were definitely not people that did really well on the selling side of things. They were people that were maybe, average sellers, but the upper management saw in them some key characteristics that would make them good managers. So it's really no different than, any other area of the sport industry in terms of looking for people that you think are good leaders, people who are well organized, good planners, that sort of thing. Okay, so what does managing a sales force entail? Well, you can see it's essentially this process that I've outlined here on the slide. So starting here with recruitment. So obviously sales managers are going to be tasked with recruiting talent into their inside sales department. And from there, actually making hiring decisions based on that initial inside sales practice. Of course, there's going to be training that goes along with Salesforce management. So, whether the decision is to do some internal training or outsourcing of that training, that usually falls on the shoulders of the sales manager. Motivating is another piece involved with managing a sales force, and one that we'll talk a little bit more about here later. Evaluating, so actually providing feedback to ticket sales reps is a really important component of the managing process. So you can see that this is a cycle, meaning that it really never ends, right? So managing a sales force for a sport organization is this ongoing, constant cycle that starts with recruiting and involves or ends with evaluating. And then, the process continues, as we know, based on the high turnover rates in ticket sales departments. Okay, so I want to talk just briefly about each of these steps that we just identified on the last slide. So the recruitment piece. A couple things that we know that are definitely barriers to the recruitment piece of sales management. We know that there are a lot of ticket sales jobs, but they're also very low pay in terms of entry level positions, and it's pretty competitive. So that's one barrier for recruitment. Another is there's definitely a lack of training or education across sport management programs in the country, and this is something that I've looked at a little bit, and other scholars have looked at and identified as a problem. Right, that a lot of sport management programs do not include any kind of selling in their curriculum, and actually you having this class right now is actually pretty rare for sport management programs, either at the undergrad or graduate level. So, that's definitely a barrier to recruitment as well, because there's just not a lot of folks graduating with the degree in sport management that have the skill set related to ticket sales. So that recruitment piece can be tricky. Now, there are some recruiting methods that teams employ, and some more recent trends here are things like sales workshops. So, teams might partner with other teams within their region to host a sales workshop or job fair. That includes maybe a 2 or 3 day workshop where people that are interested in working in sport come to the workshop. They learn about different techniques, they do role plays, they do a lot of different scenarios that allow teams to actually kind of check out how skilled these prospects might be as sales reps, which can ultimately lead to job offers at the end of those workshops. I will say that teams have gotten better about trying to partner with sport management programs, especially as more have added sales classes. This happened to me just this semester. Someone from the Cavaliers contacted me about wanting to make a connection, and basically, has said if anyone in our program is interested in ticket sales, that this would be a pipeline for them to connect. So I think more and more teams are seeing the value in developing relationships with universities that have sport management programs. And then, we've mentioned the MLS's National Sales Center before, and here this is another great recruitment method. So the league itself has created this training center where they're essentially training their own talent to be recruited into team staffs. So far the MLS has been really successful implementing this, and again, they have far less turnover because they're actually, developing and training these people as a league. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more leagues looking at a similar model in terms of recruitment. All right, the next step or phase of sales management is hiring. We know that it costs a lot of money for teams to hire staff. There's a lot of investment in that HR process. And so, because of that, in terms of the time investment, the interview process, any kind of training, initial training that's done, we know that they're looking to hire people to stay, right, and avoid losing that initial investment. This is one of the few jobs in sport where managers are actually looking for return on investment for their hires, right? Where they can actually link revenue generation to individuals that they've hired, which is kind of a unique aspect of managing sales staff versus, say, other departments for a sport organization. One thing that's kind of cool that I've seen some teams do recently is this idea of a training academy. So the Tampa Bay Lightning and the NHL have done this for the past few years, where they have their own sales academy, where essentially it's no longer this idea of inside sales where you're kind of hired in and you either do well or you're fired. They actually have this academy where they're training people that they hire to really succeed and do well within the organization. And something like this or this model can be kind of copied to other leagues and other teams, and it's really looking at it from an investment perspective, saying if we're going to invest the money and the time hiring these people, we should probably make sure that we also provide them with information to keep them around. I won't get too much into what sport sales managers are looking for, because I think we know from talking to all of our guest speakers this semester that It's different for every individual manager, it's different for every team, it's different for every league. I can say from my own experience in studying this topic, though, I think there are a couple things that stand out, across the board. And the first, of course, is experience, right? Sales managers want individuals that have some experience selling, whether that's in sport or outside of sport. Having that experience is really key, and something that stands out during the hiring process. Things like tenacity and persistence are obviously key traits for someone who's going to be selling on a day to day basis and having to face a lot of rejection. So, those are some common traits. You hear a lot of time that, a sales rep has to be a big fan of the team in order to be successful selling that inventory. And I would say from my experience, that's probably not the case. And that actually it can be harder for someone who is, say, like a diehard fan to get into a selling role within that team. I know when I worked for the Blues, probably 80% of our sales staff were from outside of St. Louis, and really had no connection to the Blues to begin with. Obviously, over time, they became fans. But I don't think fandom is something that sales managers are looking for, or probably should be looking for, as it doesn't really have any impact on someone's ability to sell. There are some non traditional hiring tools out there available to sales managers. So, we talked a little bit about some of these when we spoke with Anthony in our Zoom call. But things like psychometric testing, which are basically just standardized tests where you evaluate someone's mental abilities or their personality. Pretty sure Anthony said that that's what he used, a personality test, when he worked for the Bulls, to sort of gauge, people in a more in-depth manner than just asking some basic interview questions. So psychometric testing can be really helpful if you want to dig a little bit deeper. And then assessment centers is basically just a process where candidates are evaluated for their suitability for an employment through some kind of simulation exercise. So one example that I've heard sales managers do is basically giving a prospect like a pile of mail, or maybe an inbox full of emails, where they have to go through and sort through it and prioritize which ones they're going to respond to first. So something like that, just to sort of gauge how they act under pressure, but also how their mind thinks and how their brain works. There are certainly pros to administering some of this testing or creating some of these scenarios. You certainly get a lot more information about a prospect this way. You might gather underlying information that you wouldn't have gotten just based on a traditional interview. The cons probably related to cost and time, right, of doing these things, and obviously having a limiting hiring budget. A sport organization may not have the ability to employ a lot of these things, but again, there's a lot of data to support it, and if there is a big investment in that initial hire, it might be worth taking the extra time and money to do some additional testing. All right, the next phase of sales management is training. So once sales reps are hired, of course, someone has to be tasked with training those individuals, or at least managing the training process. That's typically the sales manager. So some of you, actually many of you, wrote about this topic of the need for ongoing training across the sport industry when it comes to ticket sales for your issue papers. And this is a topic I'm pretty interested in as well. Essentially, what the scholars have found on this topic is that it's not just important for there to be that initial phase of training when a sales rep is hired, but truly a need for ongoing training once they're on the job. And that just because you complete maybe a 2-day or week-long sales training does not mean that you're not going to need additional training down the road. So that's really a push right now for a lot of teams. And of course, it's also an investment of time and money. So it's convincing teams that it's worthwhile, that it's going to lead to higher numbers in terms of revenue generation, as well as getting ticket sales reps to stay at these jobs for longer if they feel supported through professional development initiatives. There are some proven effective training strategies in ticket sales departments. So, putting together scripts and having sales reps utilize those scripts is obviously a pretty basic one. Role play is really effective in terms of training. This, while painful, audio and visual recording and then evaluation can be really helpful. And then observations, so having the sales manager actually watch the sales reps as they're practicing a lot of the tactics or techniques they've used, and then providing feedback could be really effective in terms of training. Again, you can see that this could be pretty time intensive for a sales manager. So on top of, perpetually having to sort of recruit and hire and the other elements of sales management, this training piece tends to take up a lot of time. Now, to go along with that, there are a number of third-party sales trainers out there. So a number of sales professionals who maybe used to work in the industry and are now acting as consultants who've created models for training sales staff. Stadium Gorilla is a good example. They have a lot of videos online. The Ultimate Toolkit is another one that a lot of minor league teams and college athletic departments use. I'm pretty sure ISU Athletics has the Ultimate Toolkit, and we actually have a copy in the sport management program if anyone's ever interested in taking a look at that. But that is one alternative, is sort of outsourcing the training of your staff if that's not something the sales manager themselves can manage or has the time to do. All right, the next phase of sales management is motivating. Now, this is obviously an important characteristic or tactic that any manager would have to do, right? Motivate their staff. But motivation really does matter a little bit more in sales than other areas of sport. If you think about it, the teams rely on having stable, continued revenue generation from the ticket sales department, right? And we also know that ticket sales can be a grind. It's a lot of phone calls, it's a lot of rejection, which means that it's really important that they have continued motivation so that they can sustain, that revenue generation. This is especially important when the team is bad, right? And I can speak to this firsthand, having worked for the Blues when they were not good at all. That those days can be long, especially for the sales reps who are on the phones making the calls. So really important that the sales managers in place have the ability to motivate. A couple things here to think about in terms of sales managers and motivation. So for ticket sales reps, things like effort and fairness matter. So in order for them to be motivated to continue to do their jobs and hit their benchmarks, they have to feel that their effort is actually matched with whatever reward or whatever incentive is involved, right? So that kind of goes along to this idea of fairness, right? So the system itself has to be set up in a way that is viewed as fair. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to continue to motivate. And that also goes along with this idea of sales culture, right? So the actual environment within that department on a day-to-day basis has to be positive, has to be motivating. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to sustain any kind of leadership or management within that system. Now, some common incentives for sales executives. Certainly, commission structure is number one, right? We see this in pretty much any professional sport setting. The sales reps work on a pretty low base salary, but then have the potential to gain a lot more money through their commissions on their sales. If you've just finished up, or maybe you're just finishing up the last of the Daniel Pink book, you'll know in one of those final chapters, he kind of poses this idea about rethinking sales commissions, which I do think is really interesting. I'm not fully convinced it will work in sport, but I do think it's interesting. He says that essentially if you throw out commissions and just pay everyone, a more favorable rate of pay, more favorable salary, then you'll have more collaboration and less turnover. And it's an interesting argument, and one that I would like to see someone experiment with. We'll see if it actually works, but I think it could be an interesting way to think about things. Other common incentives for sales reps, public recognition is a big one. I know when I worked for the Blues, one of my job duties one week was to order some banners for our office so that we could actually kind of create like a hall of fame for our ticket sales reps once they hit certain records or benchmarks. That public recognition piece is huge, and that kind of goes along with the idea of sales culture, right? This idea that we're going to celebrate sales reps when they make sales, when they hit benchmarks. Another big one for us was just the emails, right? If someone made a sale, they sent out an email to the full department, and then there was a lot of praise in response to that initial email. So public recognition is a good way to keep up motivation. And then any non-cash incentives as well. I know when I worked for the Blues, one of our biggest incentives was that we had this casino sponsorship with the team, with the Lumiere Casino in St. Louis. And the casino was new at the time, and part of the sponsorship arrangement meant that the team got a bunch of lunch vouchers for free lunches at the casino. And so our managers would hand these out to the sales reps and our staff. And basically, I'll just say that I didn't pay for lunch for a year with these lunch vouchers. So things like that could be really helpful in keeping up motivation as well. Okay, so the last piece, or the second to last piece rather, that I want to talk about here in terms of Salesforce management is evaluating, or the evaluation phase. So basically, there are two different types of evaluation. Sales managers can provide their ticket reps, formal or informal. So informal evaluation, think of things like hallway conversations, just kind of casual words of encouragement or feedback that you give in the office, maybe even like a handwritten note or an email, just letting one of your reps know how they're doing. That's kind of informal feedback, where formal evaluation is more like the regularly scheduled, kind of once a year, standardized approach to evaluation, where there's some kind of ratings form, there's some qualitative questions about strengths and weaknesses, and maybe a section for goal setting. So both forms of evaluation are important. Like I said, typically teams will do this at least once a year. In ticket sales, probably important to do it more often than that, given the high rates of turnover. So maybe once at the beginning of the season, once at the end of the season would be another model, or doing it during the off season when things are a little bit slower. One of the nice things about evaluating ticket sales reps, and we already kind of mentioned this, is that the ROI piece, right? That we can actually kind of tie a number to a sales productivity for individual reps. So it's fairly easy to measure this. Obviously having a good CRM system helps, right? Where reps are logging their sales and the calls they make and that kind of thing. Then it becomes fairly easy for the manager to kind of look those things up and do comparisons and provide feedback. Of course, the evaluation also needs to include things outside of just that revenue generation, so kind of looking beyond how much they generated in ticket sales. And there are a number of different pieces that can be looked at here, right? Just looking at in terms of effort, the number of calls they made, appointments set, time they spent on the phone with prospects, and just their overall closing ratio. These things don't deal specifically with revenue, but they can certainly show things like effort, which are also important to be considered, especially for a team that might be performing poorly. Okay, last piece that I want to talk about is maybe the not so fun piece, but important to note, which is discipline and termination. So if someone's working as a sales manager in a ticket office, at some point they're either going to have to discipline employees and or terminate employees. So there are a few things to keep in mind here, kind of some tips. It's really important that sales managers keep thorough records and document any issues that might come up. Now, this is, of course, something that would be important for any manager, but also important for ticket sales managers. Keeping keeping any kind of meetings about discipline or termination pretty quiet or private is important. This can be tricky in a ticket sales office, which again could be really a wide open space of cubicles, but trying to keep things private if possible is important. Making sure you're following up or closing the loop. So if someone is terminated, making sure any password protected accounts are turned off or terminated. And then one other aspect to consider, and a lot of teams do this, is they have reps sign non-compete agreements. which would maybe either not allow them to compete with competitors, or sorry, not allow them to take jobs with competing teams, or at least limit their ability to take information with them, right? Because individual sports teams do have their own systems, their own ways of doing things, and a lot of teams are really protective over those models. So they want to make sure that sales reps that leave, especially if they're leaving on a bad note, aren't taking that information with them and providing it to competitors. I won't lie, this part of the job is tough, and I've seen a lot of sort of bad interactions surrounding discipline or termination within ticket sales departments. You have to keep in mind you're dealing with a lot of young individuals, a lot of young men in particular. So at times, there is tension there, and there can be arguments. And as much as possible, keeping cool heads is important, especially if you're in the management position. All right. Well, you made it to the end. So, because you made it to the end, I'm going to share with you a little tidbit, and this will be on the final exam as a bonus question. So, little reward for you for making it this far into our last video lecture. Okay, so this is my name tag from when I worked for the St. Louis Blues, or I should say, kind of my nameplate holder for my office. And it's the one keepsake that I took from my time with the St. Louis Blues. And this is my, my first real job, my first real full-time job in the sport industry, and just a really great experience overall. And I really enjoyed teaching this class and sharing with you some of the things I learned from working in sales, and also some of the things I study now as a scholar in this area. So I hope you enjoyed learning about sales with me this semester, and yeah, have a great week.